So, chapter 2, concepts. Just like when you learn how to walk, then you learn how to run. Well, before using a bicycle, you need to use a tricycle. Well, you know the fundamentals. Now we can learn the concepts. All of the things that are actually going to occur during your games. Are you always going to be able to get a fork in a game? Probably not. You might get a fork that makes you win the game 1 game out of 20, maybe 1 game out of 100. It depends. Maybe every single game. But once you get to a stronger level, you're not just going to win the games tactically. You're not always going to get pins. You're not going to always get those things. Because to get those things, you're going to need to build up your position. And we're getting to that part. So, you up a pawn, and you want to get your pawn to the other side. So you push your pawn 1 square, and then 2 square, and then 3 square. And you lose your pawn. That's unfortunate. And it didn't have to happen. What could you have done? Have you heard about key squares? Key squares are just like when you want to go buy something and you need money. If you want to go buy something and you don't have money, you're going to need to be lucky to buy something. So in this case, it's the same thing. If you don't know about key squares, the only way you're going to win this is by pretty much stealing the game, right? Meaning black is just going to make a huge blunder and you're going to capitalize on this. Those are the key square right here. Meaning if your king gets to those key squares, any of those key squares, you win. Now obviously if your king gets to those key square and then black king capture your pawn, you're not going to win. You need to get to the key square and make sure your pawn is still there. So, which way do you want to go? This way? This way? Does it matter? What do you think? It does matter. You want to go the squares the further away from black's king, and this way, once you get there, black's king is not on time to stop you. And if he stops you, then you take the opposition. And this way you do get to a key square. Now the key square changes from one file to another file. If your pawn is on the 4th rank, on the 3rd rank, or the 2nd rank, or the 5th rank, the key squares are always a little bit above. Not right here. Getting to those squares doesn't guarantee you anything. But if you can get to the square and having the opposition, then that means you're going to be able to win, because you're going to be able to get to a key square. And once you get to those key squares, all you need to do is push your pawn to the 5th rank in this case. This way, there are no stalemate, because the king is on the A file. And if the king is on the A file and black is trying to be a little bit clever, black is going to find a way to get stalemated, which is a draw in chess. And a draw is not always good or bad, but if you can win and you make a draw, it's not that great. It's like when you want to go buy something and you could have got the same thing but in the same quantity at a lower price. You probably would have wanted to do that. So, in this case, you can just push your pawn. Once the pawn is on the 5th rank, the key squares expand. Now there are no 3 key squares, there are 6 key squares. And once that happens, to make sure there are no stalemates, you let black take the opposition, but you're on a key square, and you use this pawn to get the opposition back. Let me put it this way. To avoid stalemate, you don't want to push this pawn when the king is here. So let's say white, for instance, kind of fools around and wastes the tempo and goes here. Now white has the opposition. Great. White has the opposition again. Great. But white pushes when the king is here. That's not great because you're going to push the pawn with check. And that's stalemate. There's not an easy way to put it. If you don't understand this, the best way for you is to memorize it. You don't want to push with a check. You want to push when the king is already facing your pawn. Because you see, if you push when it's a check, it's a draw. So having the opposition is great, but sometimes you can just give the opposition. You give the opposition, you get the opposition back and you push the pawn. And now you win. So this was the first part of this concept chapter. And we're not going to look at this really simple endgame anymore, but we're going to look at more fun one. Here, what do you think is going on? If it's white's turn, what do you think? Do you think white is winning? Do you think black is winning? I hope not. If you think black is winning, you should go back to chapter 1. Well, if you say that this is a draw, you're correct, because it's white's turn. And black has the opposition, and those are the key square. So there's no way for white to get to those key square, unless black makes a misstep. If black doesn't do a misstep, white's going to have to push the pawn at some point or another, and black is always going to take the opposition on time. Always. Until it's too late, and there is nothing to do anymore. It's a draw. It always kind of confuses me still, but I try to just take the opposition if I have black, and stop white from going to the key squares. Because look, if you let white go to the key square, it doesn't matter if they take the opposition or not. If they take the opposition, they're just going to make a road for the pawn. And if you take the opposition, they're going to take the opposition back by just pushing the pawn. Now, like we looked at earlier, if it's a B pawn or a G pawn, you have to be a little bit careful with stalemates. Now, this is a really famous one. How about this one? You have white. What are the key squares? First question. Is this a key square? No. Is this a key square? No. Key squares are F4, G4, and H4. Which square would you want to go to? Well, what do you think the fastest way is to H4? Because you don't just want to go to the key square, you want to actually capture this pawn. Let's count together. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3. Very well. And black is never going to be on time. And even if black is on time, at least you tried your best and you played the best moves. Now, what do you think black should try here? Do you think black can maybe do something a little bit different here? They can. Black can actually just move his pawn forward. If black plays this move and white goes on with his plan, then black is completely okay because of this. So there's no way to win this as white because this king is going to get there on time. This is a complete draw. And even if the king doesn't get there on time, you can just follow white's king. And there's nothing to do as white because you're just going to follow the king over and over again and white's going to be stalemated. So you see, that's a good try, H4. What do you think white should do now? Do you think white should just go there? No, we just tried this and H3 just equalizes. Well, you're going to tell me maybe I don't have to take this. I can play g4. Yes, but now your key squares are here, and my king's going to get there on time. And this is going to be a complete draw. So what should white do here? Well, they should go back this way. So if h3 is played, you can just play g3. You keep the key squares close to your king and far away from black's king, as far away as possible. This way, if black stops you from going to the key squares, well, they're going to stop you from going to the key square at the cost of giving you the initiative, because you just took the opposition. And now, here we go again. Now, to see if you understand well how key squares work, let's look at a more practical situation. Situation that's a little bit more likely to arise. The more pieces there is on a chess game, the most likely it is for you to get there. Because as you know, there's an infinity amount of possibilities, right? So if a lot of moves have been played, it's less likely for you to get there. But if less moves have been played, then it's more likely for you to get there. In this case, if it's white's turn or if it's black's turn, scenarios differ. If it's white's turn, well, maybe white can just take the rook, right? And then white would just lose the game then, because black would take the opposition. So if it's white's turn here, you want to unpin yourself. And then if black takes the rook, you make a draw. But what happens if it's black's turn? That's a good question. Thank you for asking it. Well, if it's black's turn, then what do you think black should do? Maybe you can try to answer your own question, which is what you should do during your own games anyway. Now that you took time to think about it and figure it out, rook takes rook doesn't work, because black is never going to get there. So black should play this. This rook is now hanging. White must take, and black got the opposition, which is how you get the opposition and the key squares. So mine squares. Mine squares are kind of like key squares, meaning the idea behind it is related to how chess work and vice versa. If you don't understand mine squares, if you don't understand key squares, it's going to be pretty complicated for you to always understand what you should do and what you should not do. So in this case, e6 and c5 are mine squares, meaning if white goes here first, white is not going to be able to win this game, because there is no way for white to just move the king and keep protecting the pawn. This pawn is going this way at this point, so you might as well go here and try to make a draw. But it's too late, the king is on the key square. So if you have white here, you really don't want to go here, right? Well, what can you do then? Well, you can go there. If black walks on the mine square, you walk on the corresponding mine square. It's like symmetrical. So now black has no good move. So there's no way for black to make a draw. So if you go there and black keeps doing the same thing, well, you can just keep doing the same thing. And they're going to lose anyway. Now if it's black's turn, let's say I triangulate myself just to get to the same position and lose a tempo. Well, if black does the same thing, it's going to lead to the exact same thing, but black's going to win. Now on the brighter side, because this pawn is on the 6th rank, which is the 3rd rank in this case, because black is going this way, white doesn't have to lose this. White can just make a draw here and just take the loss and move on. It's not the same for black. So there's no way for black to save this. White is just winning here, because even if black accepts the defeat, they will also lose the wall, because those are the key square, and you're gonna get the opposition back. So those are pretty much all you need to know about key squares. This can help you get to pretty much 2000 endgame wise, at least with pawns. Then there are a lot of other ideas with pawns, but we're not going to get to those as of now. Triangulation is also a pretty big thing, but this usually doesn't really happen in my games. But the ideas behind triangulation are really important. So if you understand triangulation, that means you're ready to understand other concepts that are just as complex as triangulation. Triangulation is a way to lose a tempo, right? So let's put it this way. It's white's turn. But let's say it's black's turn. So I'm just going to do a little trick to make it black's turn. Well, if it's black's turn, what's going on, right? Well, black has 4 possible moves. Some of those moves are just not really relevant, because this pawn's just going to queen. And if you take, this pawn's going to queen. So that's not a move. Same thing here. That's not a move. So if it's black's turn, black can either go here or here. If black goes here or here, it's pretty much the same thing. You just bring your king up. You keep bringing your king up, and if black goes here, you can actually push this pawn. And you can just win this. Okay, So, now that it's black's turn. If it's black's turn, black has no good moves. Whether black goes here or here, you're just gonna bring your king around, and you're gonna get your king really close to here, and then you're gonna push your pawn. There are no stalemates, because black has moves. So black has no good way out of this. You can always take the opposition, diagonal, forward opposition, and if black gets out of the way, you can just go grab this pawn. But hey, guess what? It's not black's turn, it's white's turn. So, how are you gonna just pass your turn? Did you figure it out? Let's see. You're gonna use triangulation. So, what is triangulation? King e5. If black trails the king and keeps the opposition and doesn't just give the tempo out, then this happened, which is pretty tragic. And if black just goes back, it's too late. Nobody can stop those pawns. It's pretty cool, right? So, now, if black goes here, we've looked at this before. If black goes here, that's when you triangulate them. And here you go, you triangulated black. So, now that we've looked at all those endgames, we're going to be able to finally look at some chess positions. If you've made it all the way to this part, congratulations. I don't know how you've done it. Well, in this situation, f7 is hanging. White could either take with the knight or with the bishop. Now, if black plays a bad move, white take with the knight and get a free rook. Pretty good, right? Now, if black plays bishop c5, you cannot want to take with the bishop. So those things are theory, okay? Not really going to explain them. You can figure it out on your own. But if black doesn't want to get into this mess, do you know what you should do? You should block with d5. I'm pretty sure you've seen this position before. Pawn take, knight f7, queen f3, and the game goes on. Or, the pawn take, black can play knight a5. And play those type of positions, which are honestly not that good for white. That's why nobody plays this as white. At least nobody that's making a living playing chess. So, at this point, we're going to look at this position, and then I would advise you to take a break because I don't think you should look at it. Now, for our next position, we will be looking at something that arises from a really original opening, which you may have heard of. It's the King's Gambit. The King's Gambit is really original, but also quite famous. Bobby Fischer himself had actually talked about the King's Gambit and really didn't acknowledge the credibility of that opening. It is not a good opening. I believe it is playable, but it is not a really good opening. High caliber players never play it and will probably never play it unless as some sort of joke or provocation. Now, if we look at this, f7 is hanging. When something is hanging, we have to find a way to protect this. Can black protect this with the queen? Sure. And then they can counterplay with d5. And even if they lose a rook, they're going to get much more than just a rook. They're going to get a knight, a bishop, and a lot of pawns. Which is why here, bishop f7 is much stronger. And then you can just play d4. And white is pretty happy here. So how would you protect f7 here? What would you do? Would you try to block, escape, capture? Blocking is the right way. d5. E takes d5, and now you can maybe put a bishop here. Make sure this pawn doesn't go anywhere, and the game goes on. This position is extremely complex, and there are a lot of forcing lines. Bishop d6 is not the only move. Bishop g7 is also a move, as well as knight h5. All those moves are played. And there are a lot of tricky things. This position happened before. I believe Morphy had this position. I think he's from the 19th century, and he's not around anymore. But his games are still haunting our memories with great joy. He had white here, and he found not such an extraordinary move, but a pretty clever move. Can you try to spot it? Well, pause the video and let's see if you figured it out. Did you think of knight f7? Well, if you did, too bad, because that's not the move. In this case, black can just play bishop here. And, okay, white has an extra exchange, but black has a pawn for it and two monster bishop. Black is maybe a little bit better here. Did you play queen takes d6? Because if you did, it is the answer. Once this knight got taken out of the picture, now all knight can jump into the battlefield and get a free queen or get a big cookie, Mr. King, and it's game over. That's why queen takes d6 is such a strong move. At this point, black's best move is probably to make some room for the king to not get checkmated, or at least not lose a queen. Let's go next. Exploiting. I really like this position. I think if you can find the answer to this position, that means you definitely have some sort of opening principle inserted into your brain, which is good. You want to be able to not just memorize things or just calculate 20 moves ahead, but have an idea, follow through with your idea, confirm it, and then execute it. Kind of like cooking, right? If you go out and buy food and you want to cook something, you don't just have to read the recipe, right? I mean, you can, but then if you lost the recipe, what are you going to do? Not eat? So, in this case, what would you do as white? Think about it. You're down a pawn, and it's not looking that great, is it? Are there any weaknesses? Are the kings safe? Is it equality material? It's not equality material. White is up a pawn. It's not even. But both kings are safe. And black moved a lot of pawns. The dark squares, c5 is a little bit weak, but the rook here is not as protected as, let's say, my rook on h1. So first you want to pause the video, try to figure it out, and hopefully you played this move. Because now, what can you do? You can attack the hanging rook. Very well. Now, this is another concept that I think is really important, and this will be the last concept of this chapter. The next chapter is going to allow you to build on more knowledge that are going to slowly get a little bit more complex and help you personalize your chess. So meaning, you're not just going to play the same moves that somebody played 200 years ago or 5 years ago, but you're actually going to be able to express yourself and then study what you want. But before to know what to study, you need to know what you're doing. And that's kind of what we're trying to do here. So, material-wise, even. Position-wise, white has a knight out, black has a bishop out. Nothing out of the ordinary, right? Or is there? Well, this bishop got out of the c8 square. Was this bishop doing anything on c8? I think it was. It was protecting b7. So, you're not just going to play queen b3. You don't have to play queen b3, because if you play queen b3, maybe I can just play queen c8, right? First, you're going to throw in a check. Now, if you throw in a check, and let's say I block with the knight, what can you do as white? You can take a free pawn. Very well. You just unpin yourself. So what is the most logical move here? Bishop d7. And now you're going to play queen b3. And now if queen c8 is played, instead of having made black just played kind of an awkward move, you made black played one awkward move followed by two awkward moves. And now you can take the pawn. And I mean, maybe black is going to play b6, but now their light squares are a little bit weakened, and you can still take on e5. So I really think, and I really hope this chapter help you along the other chapter kind of start looking at things a little bit differently, and maybe being a little bit more confident, or just being able to discern a little bit more of what is going to be your next move. We are already at chapter 3. We're more than halfway through this chess journey. And you're advised to not do it all in one time, but maybe to do little by little, and you feel at some point that it's going a little bit too fast, to take a few days off and maybe play more chess or read maybe a book on endgame if all those endgame things are confusing to you. I'll just rewatch it. So, now that we've learned a lot of things, we're going to be able to learn more things that are even more useful in order to make you a stronger chess player and a more knowledgeable one and have more fun. meaning you're going to be able to win more games and get more wins and get more ELO points. So, white and black. If it's black to play, black's just going to make a queen. It's going to be a complete draw. So, do you know how to win this as white? If you do, you can move on to the next thing. But if you don't, let's see. You want to bring your queen, and as soon as the king is blocking his own pawn, you can bring your king. Now, black doesn't have to block his own pawn. Black can go here, threatening to make a queen again. But if that happens, you're just going to bring your queen the closest it can get to get to this situation. Why is this situation really important for this type of endgame, pawn versus queen endgame, pawn on the D and E file, and also G and B file? Well, because now black has a dilemma. Either they just lose a pawn and lose a game, or block their pawn, but now you get one move to bring your king. And you're just going to do this over and over again. You're going to check the king, you're going to check the king, until you get right here. And you're going to bring your king again. When your king is close enough, you're just going to capture the pawn at this point. That's it. Now if it's a B pawn, usually it works the exact same way. But if you had maybe a pawn on A4 and A5, can you make any progress here as white? Do you think it's the same thing, or do you think there's a difference? Well, there is actually a difference. There is no way to make any progress here. Because first of all, you're going to be threatening stalemate in some cases, or you're just going to threaten to make queen. And if the queen checks you here, how does the queen get here? It's not possible. You're always going to stop her from going here. So the king is just going to awkwardly go back and forth, and there's nothing white can do about this. Nothing. And I mean, if you go here, then you just give away the game, right? But make sure you stay in the corner. Make sure you unpin yourself and not here, because then white plays this move, and then you give white a chance to actually get the king closer. You can still draw this. This is still complete draw, because black is going to do this, and it's the same problem again. But if you do that same mistake over and over again, and you go on the wrong side of the board at some point, king's going to get closer. So even if it's a drawish position, it doesn't mean it's not winnable. Queen versus C pawn, with the king on the left-hand side of the pawn. Do you think this is a draw? Do you think black can win this? Do you think white should win this? Well, let's see. Let's try the same thing, right? The pawn is pinned, so black unpins himself, right? Well, if black unpins himself here, you're going to pin the king, and if black plays the same thing over and over again, you're going to be able to do the exact same thing. And then black is going to block his own pawn. Black doesn't have to block his own pawn. Black can go in the corner. And if white takes this, that's stalemate. C and F pawn have a stalemate trick. If your king can get to the short side and go in the corner, this is a dead draw, unless white's king is close enough to actually checkmate. But we're going to look at this after. So, now, what if black's king is on the long side and not on the short side just yet? Not in the corner, and the stalemate is not ready to happen just yet. Well, that gives us a little bit more time, but that's pretty much the same thing. You're gonna throw a check to stop him from making a queen. He has to go to the short side. If he stays on the long side, you're just going to do the exact same trick, and you're going to have the time you need to bring your king and either capture the pawn or checkmate. Well, now, if he goes to the short side, you just bring your king. And if your king is on time, good for you. And if not, it's a draw. This position is one of the most studied and famous positions in chess, endgame chess. It's been studied by all of the chess enthusiasts that are trying to understand more about chess because it's a really cool concept and it's really a big classic. It means if you're above 1600, if you've played at least 5 tournaments and you've never looked at this situation before, then it's pretty detrimental to your chess because rook endgames are extremely common, and being up a pawn in a rook endgame is also extremely common. If you get to that situation, what do you do as white? How do you win this? Throw a check to get your king out of here. No, what is white's threat? Making a queen, so you have to start checking the king. And there is no way out of check. King is just going to get checked forever. So, what did we miss here? Well, we should have played rook d5. If black just ignores this and moves his king here, for instance, then what's going to happen is that we're going to be able to use our rook as a shield. And there is no way for black to catch up to this pawn. Now, what if black starts chasing the rook? You go back down 1 square. And you can still do the exact same thing, except that doing this low trick is going to take one more move. You need to go left and then diagonal. And here it is. You got the exact same thing. Now, finally, if the king keeps following you, you go all the way there, and now rook here is a big threat. King e7 is a big threat, because now you're threatening to make a queen, and your rook is covering the escape square. So there's no way out for black. If they start checking you, the king is just going to follow the rook, and there's nothing to do about this. Now this Lucena position works for the F, for the E, the D, the C, the B, and the A, but you guessed it, for the H, it's not going to help. So there's not much you can do for the A and the H. Now let's look at a little bit more of a theoretical position, okay? Kasparov was a pioneer in many openings. The dragon in the Sicilian, the classical Sicilian, the Scotch opening, and many others. In this case, this is a King's Indian. And he started making popular after Queen d2, d5. If short castle, just d5. So bishop's hanging, and things are not looking too great. If c take, what would you take with? The knight. Bishop's hanging, trade, and black is completely fine. Black equalized here. You can always take this and create an isolated pawn. You kind of want to keep an eye out on this. So maybe just play knight c6, threaten the knight, and if they take, you're going to be the one ending with an isolated pawn, but isolated pawn are not too bad. If you just go into an endgame and you have an isolated pawn, but you have active play, you actually have pretty good chances. So Queen d2 was played back then instead of castling, but after d5, black still had really good play. Let's see a couple of things that arose in the past and that could maybe come up in your positions. E take d. If you play c take d, then the problem is that what do you do with this pawn? You can't take 2 times because then everything is open. You have to try to keep some line closed somehow. So you take with E and then you play C5. That's the best things I came up with. Trying to at least kind of close down some line of attacks. But after knight C6, black sacrifice an exchange and then play queen F8. White's tried 2 moves here, knight takes C6 and knight CB5. They both lead to really good position for black, but knight CB5 is a little bit more interesting. If knight takes C6, you're going to trade, you're going to bring your rook on half open file, you're going to swing your rook over, and you're just going to have a really pleasant position, right? And actually, there's a forced draw in this line. Do you see it? Rook takes pawn, queen check. Now, if white does not take the bishop, and white feels like he's entitled to play a little bit longer, and plays queen g2, then you just pick up the rook, put your queen on a dark square, and play knight f6 eventually, save your knight, when white saves his rook, and you're just better. Now, knight takes c6 is not the only move. You can also play knight cb5. But black still has great compensation for being down in exchange, and just take out his pieces, use his pair of bishop, and have a great game. This is going to be the last position for part 3. This situation is maybe not going to occur in your game, this exact situation, but the idea should at some point occur. This is a really typical idea of activity and activating your pieces in an endgame. Black is down a pawn. Black is fully developed. Is white fully developed? No. White hasn't castled yet. So how do you take advantage of this? You can throw a check. It's that simple. And bring your rook on the 7th rank. Chess is not always about calculating, okay? Chess sometimes is just about doing what you feel is right, and sometimes you need to calculate if it's going to cost you a lot of material. If you're about to sacrifice a whole queen, I hope you're going to at least calculate a little bit. So congratulations on going through chapter 3, which was classics, and chapter 4 is going to be archetype, and we're really going to get a little bit more into detail about the move orders, positions, and really interesting things to try to help you learn even more